think of death and dying. For my folks that are joining us here in person, I'd also like just a quick show of hands. What's one word that comes to mind when we think about death and dying? Sadness, I'm seeing in the chat. What are some other things that we think about with death and dying? Yeah, go ahead. Celebration. Oh, great. What's another one? Yeah. Existentialism. Oh, so good. Yes. Experience. Ooh, so good. What else comes to mind? Yes. Hospice. That's a good one. What about this? Rebirth. Rebirth. Awesome. Burial. Awesome. Anything else? What comes to mind? For my folks in the chat, I see spiritual, I see celebration. That's awesome. Yes, go ahead. Legacy. Oh, such good words. I can already tell this is going to be a great panel because the audiences, y'all are on fire. So that's great. So all of these words that you've used to describe this experience, this state, right? This is a big part of why we wanted to do this panel. We wanted to bring out into the open a really informed discussion about death and dying and what that means. And my name is Dr. Hallie Edmonds. I'm actually anthropology faculty, and some of the coursework that I'm engaged in is actually interested in answering questions that happen after death. But I'm of course joined today by a whole host of panels and colleagues who also through their disciplines interact with death and dying. And so what our goal today is to have this really fun and open discussion and to give you all opportunities to ask questions and just talk about this in ways that maybe we haven't been able to before. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to do a quick introduction. I'm going to go down my line here, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to quickly introduce themselves, tell us what discipline they are representing, and just really quickly, how does death or studying death intersect in what they do?
Well, hi, I'm Jared Deinhardt, psychology faculty here. I also teach a class called Understanding Death and Dying, which is super fun. I see some of my students here, and I'm really glad that you are. This summer, actually, I had a chance to go down to Guanajuato, Mexico, and I did a study on death and dying practices in Mexico and rituals and beliefs from Mesoamerica. So I'm all about it. I love going to cemeteries. I like talking about death and dying. So our discipline is very much about the idea of coming up to death and how we approach it, like the fear of death and our conceptualization of afterlife, but also on how our communities can prepare themselves in some of the effects of death in our life. So including some pathology that can come around with inordinate fear of the unknown.
Hi, everyone. My name is Fernando Romero. I teach here at Chandler-Gilbert in the psychology department. And my area of expertise and interest is positive psychology. I have been really interested in understanding areas such as mindfulness and meditation, and I am beginning to recognize that our understanding of death could potentially be changing in psychology. We have historically been more related to kind of like a medical approach to thinking about life and death, and I am particularly interested in new developments in this area of research and practice.
Hi, everybody. I am Dr. Lily Villa. My PhD is in cultural anthropology. I do applied cultural anthropology, which means I do a lot of community work. And my work has transitioned from being specifically focused on community development into cultural reclamation processes. And a huge part of that is actually my nonprofit, where we do cultural reclamation around traditional healing practices. Healing, death and dying, and birth practices are intimately connected in a bunch of different ways. And my husband he worked as a forensic death investigator. He got his master's degree in religious studies to study curanderismo, which is a traditional Mexican healing modality. And he is currently studying for his PhD in thanatology, which is a cultural anthropological approach to understanding death. And particularly, he's looking at it from border studies. So I spent a lot of time around healers, death people, death doulas, and then my research is kind of embedded in that death practice. So I dig a lot into the cultural, emotional, and like practical processes associated with death in kind of my research. And then I teach death and dying over here and over at Mesa Community College. So yeah.
Awesome. Afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlotte Till. I'm a professor here at Chandler-Gilbert as well as Phoenix College. I'm mostly here as a sociocultural anthropologist. I teach a lot of introductory level anthropology courses, which for a lot of my students is kind of their first experience of anthropology. And a big part of anthropology is what happens to humans during their life course. And obviously a big part of that is what happens at the end of that life course. I also have a relatively interesting kind of research aspect of death and dying, in which case I don't specifically study death and dying, but during my dissertation fieldwork, I had some of my participants actually pass away. One was expected and one was a murder, and that impacted my research in very interesting and nuanced ways. So we may get to talk about that a little later.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brooke Huntoft. I am also representing anthropology faculty. I am actually a trained archaeologist, though mostly I teach cultural anthropology here. I've been teaching death and dying across culture for a couple of years. And while I no longer research, from an archaeological perspective, you can actually learn so much about people's lives from how they are presented in death. And I think that that offers a really interesting way to understand life when there's not a lot that's left of people's lives, but a gravesite is actually a very neat sort of package of what the living descendants of a deceased person wanted to be preserved with them. And so that is something that we will be talking about today.
I don't know if it's working. Okay, perfect. Hello, I am Christy Litico. I am the program director of the mortuary science program. So obviously this is right up our alley. I am a licensed funeral director, licensed embalmer, and licensed cremationist. And what we focus on over in the mortuary science program, and we have one of our mortuary science students coming in right now. So we focus on holistically how to teach students to both care for decedents themselves and care for the living. So it's a whole package deal. So about how my profession approaches death, death is sort of my profession. So it's kind of the other way around. We get to see in this profession how other cultures approach us as a representation of death. So we kind of see everybody around us with that.
Hey guys, my name is Dr. Shu, and I am a forensic pathologist. So unlike everyone else here who actually has a very good sort of wholesome view of death and dying, I have a little different perspective of people, life, and the really, really nasty things that can happen. Now, it just so happens the reason I'm here is because I'm also trained. I'm class of 2007 in the mortuary science program back when it was part of Mesa Community College, and I have come back as an adjunct professor to teach the next generation a little bit about how things work. So I have a very different perspective than everyone else here on exactly how things go down.
I love that. Thank you all so much. So you can see we have a real diversity of disciplines and backgrounds represented. And we think that's such an important part of being able to talk about this topic because it is so large and all-encompassing. Now, I noticed that one of the words that sort of cropped up across many of our panelists is this idea of culture, right? We have anthropologists, we have psychology, we have mortuary sciences. And so I'd like to ask our panelists, what do you think the intersections of culture are with this topic? How does culture influence how we mourn this experience of death and dying? And I think I'll start with our anthropology faculty first. And maybe how did that look in the past? What are some ways that we can look to the past to understand death and dying?
There you go. I am not a technology person, which is just very cliche considering I'm an archaeologist. But that's okay. Well, the very annoying answer to your question from my perspective is culture is everything, which is something I'm sure both ends of this panel will disagree on, but that's okay. Culture is going to dictate so much of everything. And if you come at a burial site or a cemetery looking for patterns, you can see them overwhelmingly in every aspect of how somebody is going to even lay out a cemetery. People don't just dig a hole any which way. You often don't bury, you make very deliberate choices about what direction the head of the person faces, whether they are laying down or whether they are seated, whether they're buried on their back or whether they're buried face down. Yes, people do bury people face down deliberately with respect. Whether there's a body to bury at all, whether they cremate them and put them in a jar, cremate them and put them in a hole, and all of these are deliberate choices based on how the living culture values or expresses value for their dead. And it is really fascinating. You will see the whole gamut for things that we consider to be extreme care and respect, for things that we in our culture might consider to be extreme disrespect, but that is respect to somebody else. And a lot of the way that we live our lives is going to be presented in how we care for those who have died, because death is just another part of life.
Thanks, and I'll put on my archaeologist hat for a little bit and kind of just focus on that kind of different cultures having different ways of doing things, and different does not mean wrong. Different just means it is different. And archaeologically, we can see this in many ways. And I'll just bring up two brief examples, both of which do very similar things. So the Lapita cemeteries in Vanuatu in the Pacific, and also Çatalhöyük in modern day Turkey, both have cemetery sites. They both have areas where they bury their dead or placed their dead. However, both of these places, one is a very condensed coral reef, the other is very tight holes in the floor under the houses. The bodies were very tightly bound together, which can only really happen if there's been some skeletonalization happen first. And in both of these cases, in these cultures, they would also reopen these graves and tombs and do things with the skulls. The skulls, or the head, is very sacred in a lot of historical cultures and even modern day cultures. And going back into the grave sites, opening the tombs, taking the skulls out, painting them with ochre, painting them with probably oils, flowers, you name it, other ceremonial aspects, and then either putting the heads back or putting in molds, plaster, clay, pottery molds of heads back, or in the cases of some Lapita cemeteries in the Pacific, putting multiple heads back, and usually not in the position where the head is meant to be. There's a fascinating case of a burial that was uncovered that had no head of its own, but had 7 other skulls placed between the legs of this individual, which everybody sitting here in this room or sitting here online hearing that is probably fascinated as why on earth and whose heads were these? And it's that thing. To us, it's strange, it's weird, it's, yeah, why would you do that? But these cultures had a reason, whether we know it or understand it. That's for anthropologists, historians, philosophers. That's where the research comes in.
So I'm going to try and answer this question while integrating our psychologists into this, and this idea of mourning. And we talked about this in the 102 class a couple of weeks ago, and we talk about it in my death and dying class. Mourning is a cultural practice. Grieving is an emotional experience. And it's really interesting to think about how we treat our dead, whether it's respectfully or not, because it always ties into the emotions that we have around our connections with them, with our feelings about them, and with our feelings about losing them. The reality is that our brains experience loss in a very complex way, which I'm sure our psychologists will be able to talk about. But when we engage in these cultural practices, we often find that in Spanish, you say la cultura cura. And a lot of these practices, whether it is decapitating your grandma and drilling a hole in her head or turning it into a cup or something like that, which, hey, we've seen it. It is a way to stay close to them, to stay connected to them. And we even talked about it in terms of like, sometimes cannibalism is about staying close and honoring a person. I love them, and so I need them to be part of me. And these are cultural practices that also help us process the incredibly challenging emotion that we call grief, which I'm gonna pass over to y'all.
Okay. Thank you. I could not agree more. There is this tendency that we have to think that cultural psychology is the study of people who are of minority groups or a specific particular ethnic descent, but everybody's cultural. Every human being is cultural. We are not raised in a vacuum. And I like the word context to help us understand how this works out, because the Latin root is contexere, which means interwoven. Our psychology is interwoven into the environments that we are part of. The way we think is influenced by the language that we speak, the experiences that we have, the rituals that we practice. So one way in which psychology tries to understand how humans experience death as well as our lives is to understand how we interpret, experience, and express mourning, for example. So there are clues that we use to interpret and to give meaning to experiences, and ways that we express those experiences that are absolutely influenced by culture. So I'll give you one specific example. I'm from Colombia, and in some parts of Colombia, if you don't actively mourn by yelling and sometimes ceasing, then you're kind of like communicating that you didn't care for the person that passed away. But in other cultures, that may be disrespectful. So the way we experience, the way we interpret, and the way we express mourning is absolutely influenced by culture.
So what we're really talking about in all of this is the living is really connected with the dying. So we kind of look at, well, how did it happen at the end? But we got to go earlier than that and say, well, how did we live? So our culture is going to tell us, well, what did we believe? If I believe that there's something happening after death, the disposition of the body might be different than if I don't believe there's something after death. So that's trying to tell us, what do we believe about life? So that's going to be the culture's rituals. It's going to be their death practices. So when we say culture, we come from more Western style individualistic culture. So we're going to approach death from that belief system. Whereas a collectivist culture, or one that has very different practices, would say, what are we doing to keep the bond? So it's fun to look at the practices that indicate, well, what do we think life is about when we approach death?
Awesome. So speaking of culture, right? And as individuals, we all participate in culture in various ways. All of us do, in this room, on our virtual chat. And so my next question for our panel, I'm going to start with our mortuary sciences folks, which is, how much say do we actually have in our own death? Whether that means how we want it to happen, whether that's how does this happen in the context of our culture? And so I'm really interested to have you all start that discussion for us.
Do you want to start, since it starts with
let's
pathology and kind of go in linear
can
there?
start with the bad stuff first. Okay, so as everyone has been saying, something you have to realize is that there are always potential clashes in understanding, in grieving, in mourning, in our perception of things. And so to give you an example of some horrible things that I've had to deal with, I had a homicide, complicated homicide. And long story short, while the people who were obtaining the body from the crime scene were trying to leave, they got attacked by about 100 people in town who wanted to do their resurrection ritual for this body. Now, this is a murder investigation, right? So you kind of want to, like, really, even very recently, I have had people, for whatever reasons, they have a different mindset on what needs to happen. And here's where you have the problem, okay? Legally, I can't release a body that has just been set on fire and murdered, and there's questions abounding. You can't let their top 100 friends come in and do anything to them, because now you're destroying an investigation. So how do you deal with the mob scene that ensues, because you have just basically said the law will not allow what you want to happen? happen. And we have this a lot when we have even just transportation of bodies. Okay. And I'm sure Chris can speak to this, is where we have a lot of very strict laws about, you think you can just throw them in your car and go where you want? No, no. But we'll have families who demand that we want them here at this time and this. Well, there are legalities and there are infectious disease issues and other issues that we have to address, which I'm going to let her talk about because I only talk about the really depressing stuff. So
Yeah, so the real answer to this question is ultimately the bad news is that, just trying to think of another way to put this, but ultimately it boils down to you do have a say over saying your wishes in life of what you would like to happen to your body after death, but you ultimately don't have any say what happens. It is who you leave behind who has a say. So we can do, I know it's just the bad news. I was trying to sugarcoat it a little bit, but I don't know. But we can put all plans in place. We can plan our whole funeral from start to finish. But if that actually happens depends on the people we leave behind. Will they actually carry out those wishes? So that's very scary for a lot of people. That's very scary for most people. That's why we are a taboo subject just in general by nature. But that being said, there are some more, I think a new term is like a death positive kind of outlooks on what can happen to you or what you want to happen to you. Because it used to be you just pick from a menu of, would you like to go into a mausoleum crypt or would you like to go into a burial plot, and what casket would you like? And that was sort of your option. And then we had cremation that became more and more popular because people were, oh my goodness, I was going to say warming up to the idea. No pun intended. Didn't know how to pivot and avoid that pun. But people are warming, but we're starting to talk about the 70s. Now we're starting to get, I brought a little prop out. We're starting to get kind of other dispositions that people are more looking into. We have something called, I don't know if you've heard of terramation or organic reduction, but this is a pig, or was a pig at one point. So you can choose now to have your body turn into, within a matter of a couple months, you can pay a company and your family will receive 500 pounds of usable soil. And there's something called water cremation, where you are reduced through chemical and water into essentially bone fragments, which is essentially ash. So, and then, but just beyond that, we have other options as far as, we don't have the typical, the standard urn. This is an urn right here. So your cremated remains would just go in there. And then we have, and then something that we always hear is, I would like to be a tree after I pass away, which is a nice thought, but logistically, your whole body becoming a tree, something we can't legally do, right? But we can connect you with companies that will produce the soil from your remains. This is a vessel that you can put your cremated remains in, and you can put a tree seed in here and then become a tree at some point. I don't want to block anything. I'm just going to put that there. And then, or you could say, you know what, forget it. I don't want an urn altogether. This would be cremated remains at the bottom. So I want to be part of a piece of art. And then you have people who they don't want to be in any vessel. I want to be a part of the ocean. And we have scattering tubes, which is just a more pleasant way for your family. This would be what your family would bring out and then scatter you places. But we have legalities that we have to think of with that. So we have, I think, and you can be a diamond, right? And you can be a diamond, and you could be, I mean, for show and tell, this tattoo right here is my brother's ashes right here. So mixed with the ink. So there are, different kind of ways we are thinking of mourning and honoring people. So you have right now, you have a driving force for that, but you also have a very kind of slow moving. We got a really strong traditional aspect, still death fearing part of our culture. all together. I mean, that's why even, I mean, if you notice, it's Halloween time. We see a lot of coffins out there, and that's where the tapered feet. We don't even do that in this country. And the reason we don't do that is we don't want it to look like a person. We just want a box. So we don't want to be reminded of that. So we have a couple clashes happening, and obviously we're moving into a more progressive, kind of more free thinking, but it's not going to happen overnight. So kind of pass it along to you.
Thank you. I actually just want to add a little bit on that. One of the reasons that cemeteries and burials are so rich for understanding culture is because you as an individual have very little say in what happens to you after you die. Archaeologically, let's just assume we all have a lot of agency after death right now, if that makes you feel better. But barring a lot of money that you hold hostage if you don't get your way after death, that's probably not going to happen. But archaeologically, we tend to think of people existing within a community, and communities come together to make decisions about how people are mourned and what the appropriate practices are. And so if you are an archaeologist digging up a cemetery, you're not actually digging up one person and being like, this is what this person was like. No, this is what this person this is what this person's community wanted them to be honored with. Just like that, yeah. With this lovely pipe music, I love it. Okay. So that's a really, really interesting way to think about it archaeologically, is that it's a burial ground is a snapshot of a community effort towards remembering their dead. And then everything that happens after that, in Dr. Till's example, you actually would have no say if they dug up your skull and did stuff with it, because it is community practice that we're looking at. If a burial was just something that was about an individual, you would have to kick it over to the psychologists more specifically, because that's more about the individual.
One other thing I wanted to add to that is we're in a different world of digital identity. And so what happens to all of your digital content when you die? So you have to, there's a legal issue here that we need to look at, that your images, your videos, if you're a content creator, can those still be used, and who gets to make that decision? So some of it's moving beyond culture and becoming very legal worldwide on that one. And I was just going to say, I had an interesting conversation over the weekend with a good friend. They cremated their father, but had to take it to another state. And well, can you just put it in the car and take the remains? Or how about TSA? Right? We start asking these questions like, so how do I put it in the carry-on or in the check bag? And do I have to have documentation? And turns out, yes, you need documentation. But like a lot of other things, they don't actually check it sometimes. So someone was like, we need to scan this. And they wanted to open up the bag and say, well, what is this? It's my dad. So probably keep your fingers out of it. There's some questions about what happens afterwards that we don't think about.
I just wanted to add to that digital footprint. There's actually digital legacies that now people are doing. So using AI technology, we can scan a person's full digital footprint, going through their emails, their text messages, their social media posts, everything. And you can actually create an AI bot of your loved one and a website of their legacy. You can pay for this. So I talk about this in my death and dying class in the transhumanism thing. So there's grandpa bot out there. So it's one thing to try and erase your footprint. It's another thing to use it. And the guy who actually invented it, his father had died before his children were able to meet him. And he wanted his children to have an idea of who his father was. So he created this technology. And so they were able to talk to grandpa bot. Now, emotionally, the conversation about it was very much like, we know it's a bot. So, you don't suddenly fall in love with the bot or something like that, the way we see oftentimes, what was it, Her with Joaquin Phoenix. And so, yeah, our digital footprints also can turn into these markers, archaeological, cultural, social, community-based markers.
Thanks. And just briefly, I only have one small anecdote to add, and it just really reinforces that, excuse me, what happens to you after you die is outside of your control. Funerals and things like that are for the living, and they're for those who left behind. So those who are left behind get to determine basically how they want to remember you. And this is kind of apt because I just had this topic in my 211 class, which is Women Across Cultures. And archaeologically and even cross-culturally in the modern times, if you identify as someone who is different from your biological appearance, for instance, if you are a biological female, but you identify as male or you identify as they, them, how do those wishes get preserved in the archaeological record? What happens to you after you die in that sense? And in a little way, we can see this in the archaeological record in areas that have a long enough burial history, where yes, there's a whole bunch of anatomical differences to maybe tell definite male, definite female with a whole bunch of gray area in the middle. We don't have time for that. That's Helly's specialty. But generally think of a bell curve, and that's basically sex determination. And if you have a large enough skeletal record, we can see similarities between how women are buried and how men are buried. And there is a fascinating gravesite in the Czech Republic where I'm probably going to get this exactly wrong because I'm under pressure to remember, but women are buried on their left side facing, I want to say east, I'm probably wrong, and men are buried on their right side facing the opposite way. But there are examples of skeletons that are more anatomically, say, female, buried in a male position, and skeletons that are more male buried in a female position. So was that a representation of a possible third gender in the archaeological record and the community respecting that individual's wishes, or is it something else? So again, if you are the deceased, you have no say in how you are buried. And if your community or your family or your wider culture isn't supportive of your identity, they're going to bury you how they want and how they saw you, not necessarily how you saw yourself.
Awesome, thank you. A word that I heard crop up in a lot of those responses was legal. And so we talked a lot about the past. And so I'm really curious from each of your perspectives, how does that medical legal aspect work in the today? What do we do if we have, say, a body whose family would like it treated one way, but legally it needs to be treated another way? All of us are probably familiar with really popular shows like CSI, right? We all have heard these terms like autopsy, but like, what does that really mean? So maybe, Rebecca, if I could start with you in your forensics training, could you speak a little to that medico-legal link?
There we go. Thank you, Gonzalez. Well, all right. Everybody still here? All right, here we go. So, unfortunately, I hate to break it to you, but if a crime has been committed, sorry, your feelings go out the window. Your culture goes out the window. Everything goes out the window. Let me give you an example of something where it's not because we want it this way is part of the problem. Okay, I already talked to you before about people trying to do the resurrection thing and whatnot, and it has happened even more recently than that. But another example, there was a woman who was very prominent in the Jewish community. Okay, very nice lady, went for a hike, disappeared, not found for weeks. Finally, a body is found. Now, there was not foul play expected. It seemed more like a heat exhaustion, got lost, something along those lines. Very sad. Okay. Well, and this was actually in Maricopa County. This is quite a few years ago. In the Jewish faith, her belief system is such that she should have been buried in Jerusalem within 24 hours of her demise. She wasn't even found for a month. Okay. So many people called the medical examiner's office. We actually had our phone system shut down. That's how upset, because she's very prominent in the community. Lovely, lovely woman, very prominent person. And it wasn't even someone's fault necessarily. Something happened where she just, got lost and ended up in the middle of nowhere and just was not found. It was, obviously they did find her. They were looking for her for a month. Okay, so what do you do now? Well, do you think her wishes were followed? Of course, everyone did whatever they could, but first you're doing a murder investigation, right? You think that takes 10 seconds? No. Everyone was calling, demanding this body that they were calling before we even got her. Okay, so here we have a problem where, because she had to be like lifted, flown over. We knew what happened because we got the call and got a heads up. So we're getting yelled at, and literally so many people called. We can't even work on anyone else in the entire county because of how many people are upset about this finding. And we can't even begin to start. And half the town wants to, shoot somebody because they don't have things their way. So you have to understand there are a lot of pressures, and that was very extreme, of course, but the point is that people feel very, very strongly about their cultural needs and religious needs, and it was very, very unfortunate. In this particular case, thankfully, no one had murdered her, but take that and then add on top of it, people sometimes who commit these crimes will intentionally do things to the body to be disrespectful. Okay, so they may know that, some rapists may know it's very humiliating to be displayed in some sort of way. So they'll leave the body in a position that seems like a very humiliating positioning because they don't want to just hurt and then kill this person. They want to hurt them in other ways at a next level. Okay, and it's really not very nice, right? But you can imagine working the business I work in, and I'm not talking about my mortuary side, but the other side. Okay, mortuary stuff is a relief compared to what I normally do in my regular practice. That's nice. People are sometimes, you can get them some grief release and this and that. No. People very often, especially in the criminal way, sudden unexpected deaths. That's my specialty. You're not expecting it. You didn't know where it came from. You're wondering what's going on. Nobody calls me just to party. Everyone, somebody killed, the doctor killed them. This one killed them. That one killed them. They died at home clutching their chest, and they have heart disease. I think maybe it's not a murder. Can we just go with no? Okay. You just have to understand that as everyone is saying here, sometimes the law, I have to follow the law. I have to report things. I have to investigate in a certain way for that person to receive justice. But make no mistake, that can be very devastating for their family, for their culture, for the community, especially if there's someone prominent in that community. And I'll shut up.
Yeah, no, so our worlds are very closely related. So doing private autopsies, we as funeral professionals would meet with families. And what I find when I meet with families is people are just generally angry at death. Why did this happen? Your mom could be 105 years old and die a peaceful death, but it has to be somebody's fault. And then they would seek justice through you. It has to be this, has to be that, where it's just really difficult for a lot of people to accept. We have a date that we have to check out, and that's just the way it is. It's too finite for a lot of people. And then we also in our world meet with the world of legalities in the sense of we have to honor culture, but at the same time we have to meet certain standards of the law. So if there was somebody of the Jewish faith, and usually you need to be buried within 24 hours. However, if you pass away on a Sunday when vital records is closed, that's going to have to be 48 hours at the least. So we have to sort of bridge that gap and help people out in that way.
I actually weirdly have something to contribute to this. I really didn't think I would. But archaeologically, I want to bring up NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And now I missed a letter in there. Anyways, it doesn't matter. It's called NAGPRA. You can Google it. But yeah, okay. Anyways, it is a law in this country about how we deal with deceased people in an archaeological context, what archaeologists are allowed to do, what they're allowed to study, how records are kept, where remains are kept, and any sort of culturally sensitive material, because archaeology and anthropology widely have been a very colonial discipline that used power in lots of negative ways. It's a sort of the goal of NAGPRA was to give some of that power back to communities who were unfairly and disproportionately affected by archaeological work. Archaeologists strangely don't want to dig up cemeteries that are only 100 years old and filled with people that they assumed were just like them. They were historically interested in people who were different or exotic, and that has disproportionately affected Native American communities. And so we see the legality in how academic research is done, what materials that archaeologists have access to, and how they are allowed to do work in order to protect communities that have not historically had as much power in that realm.
I could just add one little thing about that, talking about like the power that we have. And you talked about treating bodies disrespectfully for a reason. And that some of that stuff does step in, state level violence can happen where bodies are treated disrespectfully in order to disrespect entire populations. So, it can happen on a murder and it can happen on a genocidal scale. It's fun.
Is this on? Okay. So a couple of things that I wanted to mention are that we're all going to die, right? And the more we understand that is a natural process, and the more we understand that it's inevitable, the more we can have conversations. And that to me is like the take-home message. And I'm really happy that I'm hearing, I'm learning so much today. I feel like taking notes here because this is not my area of expertise, but I think this is very healthy for us to have great conversations, to be informed, to be educated about it, because the more we have these conversations and the more we understand this phenomena, then the more say we can have about it, right? And then in terms of the legalities, think about assisted dying, for example, how it may be legal in some countries and not in other countries, or in some states versus other states. I think those conversations are important to have and to be informed, because that may be a way for you to also exercise some agency and make some choices in terms of what you support or don't support.
Thank you all. That was wonderful. I'm going to pivot us slightly because now I want to take us on a different sort of realm and talk about science and how science seeks to understand death. I know for many of us up here, we are scientists. We teach scientific fields. I'm a forensic anthropologist and a biological anthropologist. So science is a big part about what I do and how I teach my students how to identify human remains and so on. But I think a question that often comes up that my students have asked me is this notion of, well, what happens to us after we die? What happens to our minds, our souls, right? Whatever that is. And so I'd like to turn to our panelists and give them just a few minutes to talk about how does science try to understand this? And maybe, Fernando, I'll start with psychology, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Be more than happy. So I think psychology is kind of arriving very late to this party. And for the most part, we have tried to understand death and dying from the perspective of the cultural aspects of how people experience that. We also have different definitions for death. So there is psychological death, and then there is social death and biological death, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to what happens after death, as a matter of fact, I was part of an event about 4 years ago where a person asked me directly, so what happens to the mind when there is no more brain? So when the brain ceases to exist, there is no more mind, and there you go. And I answered, yeah, pretty much that's the standpoint of psychology. And she told me, well, or somebody else in that group jumped in and said, well, that's actually not true. And I said, well, it is true from a scientific perspective. And she said again, well, not even from a scientific perspective. So I'm like, what do you mean? So it was kind of like the beginning of a path of discovering new research that is beginning to kind of gain some attention. It is not mainstream in psychology, is not the current the predominant theory, but people are beginning to be open-minded about consciousness after death. And then there's some areas where some research is happening. One of them is mediumship. And there is research and there are scientific journals of people that are reviewing protocols that actually have different layers of triple blind and quadruple blind and quintuple blind mediumship messages that are relayed. And I have explored some of that. I've read some of the literature. At this point, I can say that I'm pretty open-minded, but that I would not be as comfortable with giving the answer that I gave 4 years ago.
Okay, so I shared this a few years back in my 102 class, talking about near-death experiences. And, yeah, there's an interesting amount of literature on near-death experiences with a lot of contradictory results. And there was a movie that came out in 2023 called After Death. Have you seen it? Yeah. It was made by Angel Studios, and it very much, it seemed to really push forward the idea of kind of proving that there's a heaven and a hell in a lot of ways. So they were using people's near-death experiences to describe this. My mom is a person who experienced a near-death, or she had a near-death experience. And so she's really intense about sharing near-death experiences with me. She likes to read about it. And so she'll share these videos and interviews with people who are describing their near-death experience. Now, we can talk about medically, there's a lot of things that happen as your body is starting to shut down. Your body doesn't want to die. And so your body will flood you with all kinds of happy chemicals because it doesn't want to die. It will fight really, really hard to stay alive. And I'll let my medical doctors talk more about that. But some of these experiences probably could be explained through a biomedical lens. That being said, it's interesting to look at near-death experiences from a cross-cultural perspective. And we don't have a lot of data on near-death experiences from a cross-cultural perspective, at least in peer-reviewed information. However, there's these two stories that I like to share, these two interviews with these two different men, and they describe these near-death experiences that they had. One of the men is an Englishman who comes from a Christian background, and he describes this experience of going up, and there's light, and there's this androgynous being that is standing before him. It's a person with brown skin, and he feels that every part of him has been healed, and then suddenly he is told that he needs to do art, and so he comes back and he's become an artist, and he starts painting these abstract paintings with a lot of color. And then there's another man who comes from Mexico who talked about his near-death experience. Now, his experience involved going down. And it involved going down, down, down into this wonderful, colorful place. And it's really interesting because some afterlives go up, some go down, some go east, some go west, some go, you expand. There's a lot of different afterlives, and there's a lot of different directions for those afterlives. And from what I can see from the little bit of research I've done on these near-death experiences, we might culturally mediate our near-death experiences. So, this idea of Mictlan, for example. So this is a Mesoamerican ancient idea of an afterlife. It's a flower world, and it's below. And I thought it was interesting that this Mexican man, while probably raised Catholic, went down into this flower world, whereas this other person went up who was raised Christian. So afterlives might be very culturally mediated. That being said, I'd be interested for you to share the biomedical process.
Can everybody hear me? Yes, no? I think it's going now. Yes, yes. Okay, we got a thumbs up. Very good. Okay, so I'm going to get really depressingly boring. And let's put it this way. Okay, I was a psychology major, by the way, in school a million years ago when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. And I can tell you this, if you think about psychosis, I know this is going to sound like a little branch, but I promise you I'm going somewhere with it. I'm not just being weird. If you think about psychosis, what all of you are experiencing right now, you would consider reality, I hope, right? Or a really good dream. I'm in your really good dreams. But the point is, you are using your senses to experience reality. But it is the biochemistry in your brain that is telling you what's happening, right? Your ears are sending signals that you are now interpreting because you happen to know the language. You're understanding what I'm saying, hopefully, at least a little bit, right? My point is that, and I bring up psychosis, schizophrenia, other disorders, or drug abuse, there is a lot of evidence, obviously, if I were to alter your mental biochemistry, your reality would become different, right? And we have seen people, you know, they jump off a building because I'm Superman. No, you're not, right? So I will put this point to you as to, is it culturally determined? And I have seen a lot of things along those lines of what people feel. I'm from a very mixed background myself. So there are different religions, different cultural things in my own background. And I can tell you this, my thoughts on that personally and professionally are that your reality is your biochemistry. All right. And if your reality is your biochemistry, whatever has been your reality, whatever your mental biochemistry is going to affect what happens to you in your death throes when all your happy chemistry is coming out at the same time, trying to stop what's going down. You are probably going to think whatever you were already predisposed to think. Now, here's the catch, okay? Just because we can't prove something, this is how I feel about the paranormal stuff, and this is one of the things, as someone who isn't a huge believer in that stuff, but I have actually worked with some psychics who I was like, dang, seriously? Whoa, hello, okay? Just because we don't have a full explanation for it now doesn't mean it's not happening. I think you need to be cautiously optimistic and think about things through. You know, until a certain year, Thor the Thunder God was responsible for lightning, but we kind of have some other reasons for that. Okay, and I would caution you and urge you as scientists, and believe me, I'm the first one to be like, yeah, whatever. But just because I don't know what a ghost is doesn't mean they don't exist. How do I not know that there's not some sort of time phase shift, something or other, that, you know, the eighth dimension is right here and there's somebody standing right here, but I can't see them because we're time shifted off by a few millions, 100 millionths of a second. And when we're not, it's a ghost. Who knows? There's all sorts of weird things. Quantum mechanics. I don't know if you guys keep up with this, but I actually read quantum mechanics stuff for fun. Yes, I know, I'm a little weird. There's a lot of stuff that we don't understand. There's a lot of fuzzy logic where things that should be happening aren't even the physics we know of. Not everything is proving to be what we thought it was, okay? And one of the things I would hope that all of you keep in mind is that everything is very experiential. Every word I'm saying, not all of you are going to walk away from anything we are all saying here with the same thoughts. All right. So I would say that everybody is going to experience death differently. Everyone's going to experience life differently. And I would caution you to remember we are literally all different. Okay. And so with that in mind, you have to be very careful from a cultural, community, etc. standpoint, that no matter what you hear, see, read, it was real for that person, but there's no way for us to prove that that's real. Does that make sense?
One final thought on that one. So we're talking about science, and science is the method that we're using. And science cannot answer every question. It's the method that we're trying to use to find some predictability. So we try to explain, describe, predict, and ultimately influence. So we can come from biological sciences, from the psychological sciences, anthropology. We're trying to do our best to describe things. And when we're talking about death, you think there's so many examples of it. What is our sample? How do we measure it? Are all the measurements the same? How do we get consistency across there to say, what's the pattern? Isn't that fun to think about? But we're limited by the method that we have. So some of these questions are just going to have to remain unanswered because of the tool that we have.
And the sample size.
I'm curious, in our audience, does anybody have any thoughts or questions related to what we just talked about in terms of science and the good or not so good job science does in answering these questions? I'd just like to turn it to our audience to see if there are any questions you have or experiences or things like that. And also in my chat as well, if anybody would like to drop a question. Yeah, go ahead in the back. Just so the online folks can hear you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
In Walden, Henry David Thoreau mentions that he does not want to come to the end of his life only to realize that he had never lived. Do you think that the way we view death, specifically in Western culture, has more of an emphasis on a way for us to overcompensate our seeming insignificance within the universe and a way for people to come to peace with what we do not understand?
Oh, I'm looking at my students in the audience going, yeah, sure, we covered this, right? From the psychological point of view, of course, in Western culture, we tend to fear death because it's new, it's novel, we don't know what's going on, and so we try to avoid it. And when we try to avoid things, we tend to start being a little bit irrational. And so one of the values of having a panel or having a discussion is saying, well, avoidance tends to increase anxiety. What about approach? So if we approach it, then we understand it differently. And what I find in the classes that I teach, so maybe you can verify or disprove this, is that the more we talk about it, the anxiety scales start to go down. So that what was an uncomfortable conversation no longer is uncomfortable. So if we're talking about meaning in life, if I've lived my life unawares, trying to avoid concepts of death or loss or grief or pain, then what have I really lived? But if I'm able to accept death, accept grief, accept loss, then that's just part of the deal. And I'm living a little bit more authentically.
Excellent. And just to add briefly from kind of both archaeology and social cultural anthropology, it comes down to how we've separated life from death. And Western culture has a bad habit of treating these things as different and different stages, and in some ways not even connected to one another. Whereas if we take, for example, the ancient Egyptians, death and life weren't necessarily separate in the way that we conceptualize life and death now. And basically, as soon as someone was born, or in the case of pharaohs, as soon as they became the pharaoh, they started planning for their death. They designed their tombs. They decided where they were going to be in the afterlife. They were having consultations with the artists of kind of what aspects of the Book of Death were going to be depicted on their tomb walls. And it wasn't that death was the end. Death was just the next part of life for many people in ancient Egypt. And that's the same for a few cultures in the world today. And the other example I'll bring up is cultures and beliefs that believe in reincarnation. It's just, you've got your life now. It's not going to end when you die. You're just going to basically turn the next page of a book. And in a lot of Western cultures, that's not a mindset that we have. Death is kind of this inevitable thing that we're all barreling towards, that we hope it's going to be in a bed next to our loved ones when we're old. And for some of us, it will, and for others, it'll be a car crash.
I think it's also interesting to think about the idea of to live. And I think that oftentimes in our Western cultural idea, we might think about to live as like kind of a self-actualization process. And the thing is when you live in a very individualized culture that's very, like dominant American culture, your individual happiness, your individual significance, your individual reality has to be actualized in some way in order to quote unquote live. However, not everybody feels that way. And, we could talk about like the Maslow hierarchy of needs and how the Maslow hierarchy of needs was built off of a Blackfoot concept where self-actualization was built in a communal way rather than as an individual. You don't exist as an individual. You don't matter as an individual. You don't survive as an individual within that cultural reality. So when it comes to living, it also comes down to what is your communal reality, what is your individual reality, and what are the values that you place on those different units of existence.
Something that I think would be helpful in this particular case is to try to figure out how in psychology we talk about the mind. And historically, we have had a tendency to define mental processes as individual mental processes. But as we know, we're cultural and there is no individual psychology. Everything is an exchange. So the mind is best understood as consciousness and as flow of energy. And it turns out that the way we're built in terms of our nervous system, we are wired to connect with others. We are social by nature. And my mind and the state of my nervous system actually impacts the mind and the nervous system of the person, of every single person that I interact with. So we transcend. The mind is transcendent. And there is no voodoo about that because there is actually a biopsychological explanation for all of that. Sorry, all of that. I just get emotional when I talk about psychology. So this individualistic version of psychology doesn't hold up. And also, along with it, and I think this is a theme, the materialistic ways of thinking about life and death don't hold up either. So we need to start thinking about post-materialism. We need to think about spirituality. We need to talk about transcendence. We need to talk about the fact that we are social and that we need to connect, and the brain is built for connection.
We do have a question in the chat here, and it kind of is linked to that, what you said.
I can go ahead and read that.
Yeah.
So we have a great question in the chat, which is from Joshua. What is the significance of the primordial light often described in near-death experiences?
Okay, well, I can share, okay, so I can share, because I was like, I want to talk about this, but like, I'm also not a medical doctor. And so the thing is that our brains, those happy chemicals that we talked about, they actually flood our optical nerve as well. And so there's a lot of imagery that can happen because of the chemicals in our brain. So we could say that the only significance is that you are dying and your body doesn't want to die. We could also say that your cultural and lived reality and that light that you are describing as the primordial light in itself is a meaningful sentence bound within cultural ideas. Why are you saying primordial, for example? Are you saying that this has always existed? How do you know? Is it significant? I think it really depends on how you're thinking about it, and I'll hand it over to you.
Yay. Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out because I was just going to say, okay, primordial light, what exactly does that mean? Because I know what it could mean. I know what the word means, but I think it does speak to, this is part of the problem actually when we even talk about these things. You know, my dad was a Buddhist. My mom was Protestant. Okay. I have some very different perspectives on all sorts of stuff. Okay. So you can imagine, and I laughed because I was very, very, very close friends with a Catholic priest. And he said, wow, here I am confessing to the Buddhists. What's up with this? Right. I mean, we would laugh all the time about these things. And the reality is that you may call it a different thing. I think one of the problems that because I've actually studied a lot of these different things that these guys do, because frankly, what they do is way more interesting than what I do. Okay, what I do is just, it's very in your face and it's kind of clean cut. But this is fun because you can think about stuff that might, you know, I can't always prove it, but it's much more interesting because how can we have a conversation? You know, when you're having conversation, okay, right now I'm speaking in English. Okay, if I just start breaking it out in Mandarin, are you going to follow me? No, I might be saying the exact same thing, but are you going to understand it? If you know Mandarin, yes, you will. So here's the thing. How do we talk about something if we're not starting from the same space? Okay, and so I think sometimes the problem we run into, at least I know this happens to me when I do deal with different cultures and I have people from other places, I try to get into their headspace when I'm trying to help them, just because what one person is calling primordial light, someone else is calling God's light, someone else is calling something else. You know, it gets difficult. And one of the things I think that we try to do, I think anthropology tries to do this, psychology, I think all the sciences try to do this. We try to come up with terminology that's a little, that is not too religious based or other bases, you know, try to have something that's kind of neutral so that we can share information, right? But again, like you say, suppose all the scientists are from Europe. Suppose all the scientists are from China. there are concepts that don't necessarily exist in the same way. Like the Chinese people are very much more community. If you look at China art, okay, a lot of European art, their statues, it's very, very egocentric towards maybe humans, right? Human beings, paintings, big portraits. You look at a lot of Asian art, the people are like this big. It's a gigantic painting of fields and trees and beautiful nature pictures, and people are this big. It speaks a lot to what the culture thinks about your position in the universe, okay? They're like, yeah, you're this big and nature's this big, and deal with it. And coming from, a lot of them have Buddhist backgrounds, Taoist backgrounds, it's very different thought about where you exist in everything. And so even the discussions that we're having right now become difficult, because as much as I'd love to answer that question, and yes, you can answer that question. I can tell you all sorts of biochemical, it's not a biochem lecture. I'm not going to go there. I have 100 biochemical reasons why that might happen. Not a single one of them uses the word primordial, okay? Or not even light necessarily, because you're not actually seeing light. So just keep in mind that sometimes this is actually difficult to answer, not because we don't want to answer it, but because we're literally speaking a different language when it comes to this.
Slightly tangent, but somewhat related, given the different locations and trying to get everyone on the same page. I just have a little anecdote for you all. I don't know how many of you play video games. Put a hand up. A few? How many of you know what localization means? So localization is where you have, say, a video game product, say, released here in the US. That exact same video game title, if it's released in another area of the world or another country, has to be localized. And one of the best examples that connects directly to this panel is any video game that is released in Asia or wants to be big in an Asian market cannot have any death or gravestones or mortuary imagery in it at all. So think of your favorite video game. Think of how many times you've walked past a cemetery, seen a gravestone, seen a mausoleum. All of that imagery is completely erased and swapped with something else when it's localized to a culture that those images can't be expressed in the same way. So just trying to get everyone on the same page to even talk about some of these concepts, such as, primordial light or God's light or death in general, can be incredibly challenging.
Other questions? Those are wonderful. Yes.
How do different cultures view the interaction or, the opposite, like division of life and death?
That's a great question.
Okay, so I mean, you kind of talked about how in Western culture we like to kind of divide these things, and I think that we could get into some Emile Durkheim with some of this. And so talking about the separating the sacred and the mundane, which we haven't talked about, but we're going to talk about in class soon. So yeah, this idea that there is a separation between all these different things and they're compartmentalized into all these different boxes is a very culturally mediated idea. And, Charlotte alluded to it, where life and death aren't necessarily separate. It's moving into a stage. It might be cyclical. It's also relational. And I think that, again, talking about the, individualized concept of a person, that's also kind of creating a box and creating these little separations. And so when you talk about the separations between it, what we're really trying to do is categorize and separate things that aren't necessarily cross-culturally separate. So I'm talking about it broadly to begin with, and then I'm going to pass it off to somebody who might want to speak more specifically.
I mean, I'm thinking of this question in more of a sort of a physical sense, in that the way we view bodies, people are just uncomfortable by that separation, by that is a dead body over there. Like when I tell people what I do, and I'm sure the same for you, is usually there's a range of reaction, but it generally centers on how could you do that, right? It's and if you think about it, if somebody were to be alive 1 minute and then pass away peacefully the next, right? We are now afraid of that person who has passed away, but they're no different. They're just simply devoid of life at that point. But we attach these mysterious things to them. Oh, are they going to turn into a zombie? Are they going to be a ghost? Are they going to be this? Or aren't you afraid of that they're going to move or this or that or bump in the night? When, I think just it's very few people in this world are around it as much as we are. And if you're around anything all the time, it just becomes normal. And you just realize how there's really isn't a lot of separation. It's just sort of what we think about. I always say dead people are people too, right?
Yes.
So dead people.
They are. You make an excellent point. And yes, there are some cultures. I have actually met some people. I won't specify the cultures, but when I told them what I did, they would not shake my hand. There are cultures where you are not, they have a whole group of people who specifically attend the dead. It's sort of a taboo thing. And I mean, talk about a fast way to get yourself uninvited to a party. Like they couldn't even shake my hand because there was evil associated with being associated with the dead. So yeah, okay, no, that's when I have to, I'm actually a party planner for the PTO. Yeah, that's it. I can't tell them what I really do. So there is a lot of disconnect. And yes, I do agree. I do think in some ways it is worse in our culture. And I think it's getting worse. The one thing I think Chris can speak to this a little bit, funeral home, you've heard the term funeral home, right? Because I don't know if you know, a long time ago, lots of times people wanted to have a gathering. So what they would do is they would have a gathering, a wake, right? And they'd celebrate the body for a few days. But the biggest place in town might have been like the home of the richest guy in town. And so funeral home kind of stems from sometimes the party was at their house because they're the mayor, that kind of a thing. And, people would spend time, communities would get together and so forth. But think about how things are now, right? You guys barely have enough time to make ends meet. Most people might have to have two people in the family working. There's nobody at home taking care of grandma like it used to be, right? We've gotten very disconnected from the care of our elders. People aren't spending as much time. There are reasons for it. I'm not saying it's good or bad either. It's just the way it is. So here's the thing. More and more people are having less and less chance to experience death. And I don't mean it, we're all going to experience it. Don't get me wrong, right? Because once you're born, the only thing you're required to do is die. Everything in the middle is up to you, right? Right? That's what we're all talking about today. But the big thing is that as we get further and further away, I mean, you realize that everybody's like, oh, there's so much violence today. I'm sorry. There used to be public executions and a Saturday afternoon was like, who are they going to hang this week? Woohoo! Really, seriously, for real, okay? So they like to say it's also violent now. Yeah, I'm sorry. I played Diablo 4, okay? I kill lots of zombies and other things that are supposedly satanic. And no, I haven't seen a guy publicly hanged and then gone and partied around the body. We are very disconnected from death now. I'm not saying it's I think it's much better this way. I don't really want to go see the Lions kill anybody off in a Coliseum either. You get my point. I mean, literally, death and dying was sometimes just a fun side activity. I'm sort of glad it's virtual now. Okay. So realize that as much as people will complain, I just laugh. I'm like, dude, they used to like things like soccer, they used to use heads before they had, balls. Okay. Like there's a lot of things that I'm sure the anthropologists are laughing is like, oh, I can tell you some cultures that do that kind of stuff. So we are so disconnected, believe it or not. Death and dying was much more acceptable and people saw it more, they were involved with it more, and it wasn't looked at the same way, right?
Yeah, and I think there is a major shift, and just like this was a major shift for a lot of it, but I think during COVID and right after COVID, we started to see more of a shift of you don't have to go into a funeral home anymore. You don't have to view the body anymore. You could do everything online. You could literally have somebody pass away and not talk to another single human being. You could arrange and pay over credit card, have that person shipped to a cemetery or their urn shipped to a cemetery, have them buried, and then be done with it. And right now, and so the actual question is, but with that, is it necessarily bad? I would never disparage anybody for how they approach the situation, because we are also seeing people are just not feeling obligated to celebrate death in the way that they used to. They may go to a restaurant, because I had my brother's service at a movie theater because he liked movies. I gave everybody as party favors popcorn and a ticket to another movie. instead of spending money on a funeral. I know somebody in the profession is kind of going off brand a little bit there, but that's sort of what I'm seeing is a lot of people are saying we're not honoring the dead anymore, but we are we're kind of developing, we're kind of in the teenage years of developing a new way of doing it. Yeah.
So just the brief discussion there about, funeral home made me think of two things. So she's 100% right. It used to be, in the greater scheme of human history, just the other day, basically you would gather either in the highest profile individual's house or a home big enough to house the people you wanted, or even your own home, or you're now dead, but your family home. You'd be in your casket, maybe on a table, maybe propped up on some chairs. The community would come, they'd pay their respects, they'd have a wake, they'd have a party. You would physically be there lying dead. Maybe it was a closed coffin, maybe it was an open, but you'd be in the space. So there would be the interaction of the living individuals with either your body, if it's an open casket, or a closed, just in the space, if it's a closed casket. That's somewhat, for the most part, unheard of today. Like if I was to go to, maybe Lily's house is a bad example given you and your husband's death involvement. And if I was to go to my best friend's house one day and suddenly their grandma had passed away and she was lying there on the kitchen table, I'd be a little bit weirded out. I'd get on with it because I'm an anthropologist, but it's not really the done thing anymore as it was, I want to say ballpark 200 years ago, or at least the Victorian era. Big deal. And if anyone is familiar with Victoria era death portraits, when photography just become a big thing, people would get pictures. Pictures were important. People would get pictures of relatives, families, babies, people who had died. They'd make them look as good as they could. It was black and white photography, so they could get away with a few things. And death portraits were a very important thing. In the modern age, photography is everywhere. I don't need to tell you all that, but it comes this ethical question of how do you want to remember this person? Do you want to remember this person as they lived, as at their prime and their best, or do you want to remember them as they're dead? Maybe not, maybe yes, maybe no. And the other example I'll just leave is the death of high-profile individuals that lie in state. So everybody in this room was probably alive when the recent Queen of England passed away. She lay in state, her body laid in state for people and mourners to pay their respects to. There were long, incredibly long lines where you would just walk past her body, lie in state. If any of you have seen Lenin's body, which is still perfectly preserved, you can go pay your respects to Lenin. But the thought of seeing a body to go pay your respects to is becoming more and more rare in at least modern Western industrialized societies.
Awesome. Thank you all. I'd like to turn to the chat because we have some great questions that populated there. And both Whitney and Maitland asked some really cool questions. They're separate questions, but I think they certainly have some overlap between the two. So Whitney had asked about the loss of an uncle and looking back, what can someone do who is going through this, or how do we help someone who has given up? And then Maitland made a point about, well, what happens to our mind when you're dying? Like, what is that like cacophony of signals, biochemically, whatever that might be? Is there a sense of fear and anxiety? Is there acceptance? Is this something that's different for every person? And so maybe I'll have my psychology faculty start tackling any one of those things.
I'll start with the first question that was asked, looking back, what can someone do? What can someone who is going through this? So we're looking at two different things. It sounds like this might be a tragedy like suicide. That is one of the methods of death. And we have to look at two sides of it. One of them might be grief. The other one might be trauma. And they are the way that we are addressing this, because oftentimes an unexpected or a violent or an out of character death is not only something that we're learning to live with the loss, but we're learning to live with the what does it mean. So what I find a lot of times is we think that we're saying grief, but what we're really talking about is shock and trauma. And that is a biological, physical response that our body is going through. And we use the big T word a lot, but really I like to look at it as just being stuck. Sometimes we're just stuck on whatever happened keeps replaying. Sometimes there's survivor guilt. It makes me think about my own belief systems and values. Sometimes there's legal issues where we didn't have a chance to really say goodbye, or we didn't have a chance to see it, choose the disposition of the body. And so all of these things cause disturbance in my body. And when that disturbance gets locked in, what we usually do is anytime that memory comes up, my body re-enters that state of disturbance. That's what we're talking about with trauma. It's not the same thing as grief, because grief is a process that we've talked about before. There's cultural mourning that we are trying to follow our practices, but grief is designed to help my brain and my body adjust to loss. So the question really begs to what Dr. Romero had said, is that we are bonding people. We like to connect. We are designed to do that. We wouldn't care about loss if we didn't connect to somebody. So that is our task, is to understand the difference. So what do? We have to recognize that sometimes there needs to be some trauma work and getting unstuck. Some of our religious practices are designed to help us get through trauma work. Some of our cultural practices are designed to get us through trauma work. But sometimes we don't have access to those. We have in North America, we have pretty isolated society. So then we have professionals that can help us with some of that trauma work. So it's recognizing the need for that side. The grieving it's not just time heals all wounds. It's the connection with your support system and the ability to work through mentally and physically what's going on with the loss that's actually going to help that more than anything. So I think I answered the first part of that. Do you want to chime in? Nobody? I'll keep talking, but make sure that I'm not the only voice.
Something that I like to highlight, I teach positive psychology, and I often get a lot of misconceptions when I start the course, because people, when they sign up for positive psychology, they think it's the scientific study of happiness, in the sense that happiness is only positive emotions. But in reality, the Greek root of that word, eudaimonia, is a mistranslation. Instead, it should have been described as growth or flourishing. And the human experience is a combination of emotions that tend to be towards the positive side of the spectrum and to the negative side of the spectrum. But sometimes we're very dualistic, and we like to think about the world as black and white. But the more we understand that life is more complex, that the same event can have both positive and negative qualities. So I'll give you an example. Do you know what the concept of bridezillas is? So these brides that if one thing goes wrong, then like everything is ruined, and and it may have been a minor detail or a minor delay or something, but then the whole, everybody's out to get them and to ruin their lives. But in reality, the more we can learn to understand that life is complex, that any moment has positive and not so positive sides, that sadness can actually be part of a meaningful life, that sometimes grief and anxiety can help us understand our sense of purpose and meaning. The more we can have a healthier approach, because you were talking about avoidance versus approach, the more we can approach these aspects of our humanity, and the more we can connect and find social support, then the better we will be at dealing with all of these challenges.
Running out of time.
And actually, if we can follow that thread, something I'd like as we come to a close, first off, are there other questions from our audience that we can answer? These have been amazing questions, by the way. So we're happy to dedicate. Yeah, here. Okay. Amazing. Hi, Mom. I love it. Questions, though, any other? These have been wonderful questions. We can't thank you enough for these like really thoughtful questions and everything. Yeah, question here. Tiny microphone.
So mine sort of has more of a tie into like the legal, like criminal side, but a really controversial topic is death row. And like, is killing somebody ever like a justifiable action to something? Because I like looking at the stories of people who are on death row, like the guy who complained, like his last words, he complained that he got SpaghettiOs instead of, he got spaghetti instead of SpaghettiOs for his last meal, and he said he wanted the press to know about it. or like the stories of people, getting like all the way to the table, and then they call in and they're like, they find out that it actually wasn't them. And you think about what would happen if that call came in like 5 minutes later, kind of thing. Like, so is there like any thought, like, is death ever like a justifiable like reaction to something such as this?
Well, let me put it to you this way, because you're now asking a question of justice. Okay, so if I go to your house and axe murder your entire family, and they've done nothing to me, and I've never met them before, was that a justifiable crime in your mind? Okay, now let me back up. If I did the same thing to someone who was a known serial killer who maybe nuked an innocent town, is that a justifiable murder? You see the problem. So think about war, okay? If I gave you a gun and said, see that guy dressed differently than you, go kill him. If you did that right now, recreationally, it's a problem. If you're wearing a uniform and you're on my side and he's wearing a uniform and he's not on my side, you were just made a hero. You see why your question is difficult? There's not a great answer for that. And what I hate to say is that in our society around the world, justice, what's right and what's wrong, a lot of it is dependent on the year, the date, the time. Look at something like slavery. It's kind of a not cool thing for the most part in most places in the world. I will not say all. There was a time when that was just the way things were. What's wrong with you? Okay, so when you think about what is okay and what is not okay, it's very dependent on the community, the society, what is acceptable around the world. What is the bigger our communities get, maybe certain things that were acceptable in our society were not. One of the things I think anthropologists deal with all the time is, like they said, this is something offensive in this culture. This would have been a heroic measure in a different culture. I think you really have to, take a little bit of a step back before you start pointing fingers at that. Now, that said, there are certain things that I think, are legalities here, and we just have to deal with them in terms of justice, but it can be very relative.
I do want to speak to that. And really, I think I just want to reiterate a lot of what you said. But whether it's right or wrong, as an anthropologist, I don't think anything is right or wrong. I have a really complicated relationship with the word truth, because I think that it's all relative. And I don't know, maybe your question was, what do we think personally? But I would tell you that I'm probably never going to tell you that. My students love to ask me questions, and then I just ask them questions instead. They get real cranky about it for some reason. I don't know why. But I think the way that I would address that is to turn it back to you. In my opinion, I don't actually make the rules. I have very limited authority in one very specific context down the hallway, and so but it's going to depend on the culture, but the culture's religious perspectives and their relationship with what death is and what life is and whose life is important and whose life is not. And I think that in communities, I'm going to postulate a little bit, in communities where an individual is really, really important, they're going to have a very complicated relationship with identifying whether the person that was killed is more important than the person who is the killer, right? And I don't remember which death and dying class I taught, but they were really, really, they were such big fans of Dexter. Like, Dexter could actually do, was it your death and dying class? Yes. Dexter could do no wrong. And I kept like spitballing, but what if this, what if this, what is, like, no, he only kills bad people. It's okay. He could do anything he wants. It was absolutely fascinating, the psychology of what was moral and what was not in that. And that's really going to depend on the religious background, the community background, and how individuals integrate together in that. And then it's also going to change generationally. And I'm very curious, actually, if this is a younger generation thing, and if it would compare to how it would compare to millennials and Gen X and boomers too, because we all have a very different relationship with all of this based on the socio-political context that we have grown up in.
unfortunately. I don't
Okay,
want
I'm gonna be annoying one more thing. So this gets into the concept of retributivism versus consequentialism. Retributivism comes from the idea of retribution. They did something wrong and therefore they should be punished. Whereas consequentialism gets into the idea that there needs to be an outcome that has a positive result from whatever we do in response to somebody doing something. So what are the consequences of somebody doing this? What are the consequences of us killing this person versus they need to be punished? So I think that, you know, it really comes down to what are your values? Do you lean towards a retributivist perspective of people who do bad things need to be punished? Or are you a consequentialist? What are the outcomes? What are the consequences of killing this person?
Thank you all. Those were such wonderful questions. Thank you so much. I realize we are at time. We're actually a few minutes over. So I realize that we shall draw it to a close, but I just wanted to thank you all for participating. I hope you all found this to be enjoyable, if that's the right word, or informative maybe, to folks online for your wonderful questions and engagement, and of course to our amazing panelists. So if I could just get a quick round of applause to thank all of them. Woo! And if anybody does have questions, or if you're curious in the coursework that we all teach, or the disciplines, or you're interested in going into a field that aligns with what we've talked about up here, please come and chat with us. But otherwise, thank you so much again. We appreciate all of you being here, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their Tuesday. Everyone in my class got